The brutal ballad of Fangus Klot is a game that Oddworld Inhabitants worked on during the 2000s, but ultimately ended up being one of the many unreleased games by the studio. Initially it was thought of as being an April Fool's joke because it was first announced in an issue of Game Informer in April 2005, literally the same month that Oddworld Inhabitants shut down, being slated for a release on Xbox the next year, which of course didn't happen. And after that it wasn't acknowledged again until the June 2009 edition of Game Informer, where Oddworld creator Lorne Lanning officially spoke about the project. Originating from documents and discussions for a potential sequel to Oddworld Stranger's Wrath, Fangus Klot was going to be somewhat of a spiritual successor to Stranger, which you can tell just by looking at the art. You know, it has that very western feel. It would have taken place on Oddworld in a rural country called FANGUSTAN, which I keep calling Fergustan for some reason, which is on an entirely different continent to Mudos, far away from where the rest of the Oddworld franchise has taken place so far. This nation would be inhabited by people who were descended from dogs, apparently specifically bulldogs, and were not necessarily like native type characters, but they were indigenous and very close to the land, being nomads and taking on natural roles such as herdsmen. However, they would be put in peril when Fangustan is invaded by a neighbouring country of a race evolved from cats, known as the Vamps. These cat people would be more industrialist than the nomadic dog people, and as a result would apparently very easily take over their territory. This whole dynamic betwixt the two countries takes inspiration from various real-world situations between nations. As you might have guessed from the name, Fangustan resembles and is representative of Afghanistan, and the idea of it being invaded by the Vamps was taken from the United States and Allies' invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, and their propaganda approach of seeming as though they're liberating the land, even though their intentions may actually be far more malicious. The relationship between the Vamps and the Fangustanians, I guess that's what they might be called, is a play on the myth of the long bitter rivalry between cats and dogs, and the supposed battle between the two species. The Vamps and the people of Fangustan, being descendants of cats and dogs respectively, naturally instinctively have a deep-seated hatred of each other from their past, even though they're both now sentient, intelligent civilizations. Lorne compares this hatred of one another as being like Oddworld's equivalent of Palestine and Israel. The most interesting comparison to the real world for me though, is the inspiration of Fangustan as Eastern Europe, and the Vamp nation being based on Russia, with the Vamps themselves being based on the Russian mafia. Lorne explains it by saying, while Abe, Munch and Stranger were capturing much of the Western world's issues, Fangus would focus much more on the trials and traumas coming out of the Eastern European side of things. Imagine drug cartels and human trafficking meets Oddworld Extreme. Perhaps I find this comparison more interesting, as I would argue it seems more relevant now than the Afghanistan conflict that was prominent when Fangus was being worked on. Especially what with the way Eastern Europe seems to always fear that threat of being invaded by Russia. And here you have a game that was conceptualised way before all this situation was even at its height, with like the Crimean annexation and all that, where a country based on Russia invades a nation based on Eastern Europe. It's quite interesting, though maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but I feel like Oddworld Inhabitants were ahead of the curve on that one. So the feline mafia, the Vamps, take over Fangustan and begin building factories, labs and refineries that produce CATNIP, which to the cat-descended species is basically hardcore drugs. Meanwhile, they begin ousting and exploiting the locals. The dog people were in the labs, except others that were used for entertainment by being put into pit fighting rings. To quote Lorne, they were making fodder out of those who lived on this land before. It's kinda like gladiators, for a post-Soviet era of collapse and corruption of unimaginable magnitudes. He also explained in more detail his inspiration for this idea of the canines being reduced to this in their own land. I was watching these documentaries of these Russian cities that were basically prison cities, which were discovered after the Cold War. These cities were built in this Siberian climate or a mining area, and there would be 10 million living in this city. Everyone was a prisoner. They would build these prison cities to become sort of their own economy. They had their systems of justice, but if you were in that city, you were basically a prisoner. You didn't get to leave that city. What blew me away was the idea that there would be entire territories that were basically imprisoned. And now, blimey, so far this has literally just been world building, but we get to the protagonist of this story, Fangus Klot, a member of the dog-evolved species, and a shepherd who used to traverse his forested hills with a massive flock that he would take to popberry fields. I just want to say it's kind of interesting that his name is very similar to his country's name. Now that being said, it occurs to me that maybe Fangus is not his name. Maybe his name isn't Fangus Klot, as I've personally always assumed. Maybe Fangus is his race and Klot is his name, so it's saying the brutal ballad of the Fangus named Klot, essentially, to elongate the title. Perhaps that's what it is. So maybe his people and his species are called Fangus and Klot is just his name. Just something I thought of, but I always just assumed that Fangus Klot was his name, but thinking about it, maybe it isn't. Fangus was taken from his home when the cat people invaded, his land seized by the foreign government, and he's subsequently enslaved and forced to fight for the Vamps' entertainment as a gladiator in their pit fighting rings. After fighting multiple opponents, each one tougher than the last, eventually he faces a massive rabid fighter, crazed with rabies or a rabies-like disease, that goes on a rampage, destroying parts of the arena, which ends up allowing Fangus to escape. During the fight, however, the fighter bites Fangus, infecting him with the same disease, condemning him to eventually succumb to rabies-induced madness. As a result, the game follows Fangus as a much colder and angrier beast after his enslavement, as he fights against time in a race against the increasing onset of his disease, as he tries to repel and understand these invaders. I remember reading about this a long time ago, and for some reason I felt like this whole thing of being a race against time because of his rabies while fighting the cat people would be a gameplay element. I found that concept really interesting. There's concept art that shows that the rabies would cause him to transform, and I've always assumed that that would be some kind of gameplay, perhaps not to his advantage. To me it always seemed like you would, in the game, have to fight against losing control of yourself due to the illness. I thought that was a really fascinating idea to have as a gameplay mechanic, though again that might just be my own personal interpretation of what I read. After escaping, it becomes Fangus's mission to seek vengeance against the cat race, free his people and lead a revolt before his body is consumed and ravaged by his rabies. He does this with the help of his rabid diseased flock. Now obviously this being a game that never made it past the development stage, which of course games naturally change a lot during development in general, means that the only information we've got about Fangus Klot are essentially just scraps that have been revealed or mentioned, and a lot of the stuff we know about the game arguably contradicts each other or doesn't make sense and that kind of thing. And to me this is one of them, because firstly I couldn't find any explanation as to why his flock is also rabid like Fangus, but secondly apparently Fangus spends years as a gladiator before managing to escape, which confuses me because how does he still have his flock if he's been enslaved for years? Now my solution to these holes in the knowledge is that this is a new flock that Fangus acquires after escape. After all, he is a shepherd, gaining flocks is what he does, or did rather. And perhaps they've got rabies because maybe he infects them with it himself to gain control of them, which I guess doesn't make any sense, or to make them more violent so they can be used as weapons against the Vamps potentially. Or maybe when he's in a rabies-induced state he accidentally bites them and infects them with the disease. His flock would be of ravenous creatures described as being sheep-like, but just looking at this concept art, Fangus's flock looks a lot more like goats than sheep if you ask me, but I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, I'm not a farmer. The demon-looking sheep goats would actually play a role in the gameplay, with Oddworld Inhabitants having developed a herd management system whereby you would use GameSpeak to control the flock to solve puzzles and kill enemies. Perhaps the idea of them being rabid is also a part of this, like if you need them to attack people, maybe you could bite some of them as Fangus and infect them with your disease, turning them rabid, causing the creatures to just go on a rampage attacking your foes, but if you need them for puzzle solving, maybe you'd just leave them as not being rabid and uninfected with rabies so that you can use your shepherding skills to make them do whatever it is you need to have them do. I really like the way the gameplay and story actually takes advantage of the fact that Fangus is a shepherd, like it does another thing I love that Oddworld Inhabitants does, where they take something that in general is normal and harmless and weaponizes it. Like how the concept of GameSpeak came about in Oddworld Abe's Oddysee, as Lanning didn't want Abe to have a gun to fight enemies and instead wanted him to use dialogue and communication to achieve his goals. And likewise Fangus uses his shepherding skills to fight his enemies. Well, and guns as well. A whole lot of guns. The use of proper weaponry from a relatively large arsenal with proper bullets would be at your disposal, judging by the concept art. The brutal Ballad of Fangus Klot would have utilised the same mixture of first person and third person combat that Stranger's Wrath did, and was even built on the same engine as that game, a creation which Oddworld Inhabitants was very proud of and wanted to maximise in order to fulfil its true potential. The resultant gameplay would have been like Stranger, but has been described as being 100 times more intense. Lorne said, "We wanted to take Stranger's engine and basically reskin something more hardcore, not have live ammo, and just be like, here's a guy fighting for his life, for his people, for his territory, and the escape of his land being taken over." Further additions would have included the use of turrets and vehicles, perhaps the most famous of which being the Spider Tank, a design which was repurposed for Oddworld Soulstorm in 2021 as the Slig Mama, albeit with a slightly modified look, including a new police-inspired paint job and having 4 legs instead of 6, though interestingly it's still referred to as the Spider Tank within a lot of the files of Soulstorm. More vehicles included other types of tanks and turrets, but perhaps of more interest are helicopter-type flying machines. Plus, my favourite concept art from the game also has the faint silhouette of what looks like some kind of blimps in the background, though it's hard to tell. As if there wasn't already enough variety of a vehicular nature here, Fangus also would have apparently featured snowmobile type things. I'm sure there's probably a better way of describing that, but you know, it reminds me of those speeder bikes from Star Wars or something, which look like they would produce some very fun gameplay, I'm sure. Of course, potentially these vehicles would be used by both Fangus and his enemies, which suggests some very highly volatile situations for the player, which would have been enhanced by the destructible environments, which apparently would have played a large part in the gameplay. The brutal Ballad of Fangus Klot was said to make Stranger look like Munch in terms of tone, designed to be a much darker departure for the Oddworld franchise, as shown by the fact its title removes the Oddworld prefix, although it has also been known as Oddworld Fangus apparently. The game was expected to gain a mature rating due to being extremely hardcore, and Oddworld Inhabitants' desire to tell a serious story about the dark political themes of the time, many of which are still very relevant today. Lorne Lanning gave the team working on Fangus Klot a lot of freedom, and as a result the direction of the game shifted dramatically, to the point there was almost some kind of split within Oddworld Inhabitants in terms of how the game should be. The design of Fangus Klot ended up looking quite different to the original look, with the team thinking the whole cat and dog idea was kind of silly and childish, and as a result the characters were instead evolved to the point of essentially being human. Now, I didn't know this until I went deep into researching the game for this video, and when I saw that this was Fangus, to me it just fell off. In my head, when I think of the brutal Ballad of Fangus Klot, I've always pictured the cat people and the dog people as looking like cats and dogs, from when I first read about Fangus a very, very long time ago. Personally, my initial reaction to seeing Fangus Klot concept art like this is that it looks like Gears of War. And indeed, when I actually compared the pictures of Fangus with the main character of Gears of War, Marcus, they even have the same goatee. Even the names are kind of similar now that I think about it. The brutal Ballad of Fangus Klot. Of course, Gears of War came out in 2006 though, so this was after Fangus. But I'm just saying, I really dislike this design because to me it just doesn't look or feel like an Oddworld game, and it feels like such a saturated and boring look in my opinion. Luckily, Lorne Lanning also objected to this design of the game, to the point he said to the team, who he knew really wanted to do the game, "You can do Fangus like this, but we're not setting it on Oddworld anymore," saying that the team will have more creative freedom that way. He explained, "It would become its own place. If our characters were going to start looking like bold humans, then it would not be an Oddworld game. It would be somewhere else, not even in the Oddworld universe. In some ways, it held less appeal for me that way." And I completely agree personally. I think that this does not look like an Oddworld game, and Lanning went on to say the team that was working on it basically wanted to, in my opinion, just use all the Stranger mechanics to make a more traditional shooter. As a result, Lorne apparently lost interest in Fangus at this time, or rather this version of it, but as this rendition didn't come to pass due to Oddworld Inhabitants shutting their doors around this time, the original vision of Fangus is maintained, as shown by Lorne saying in 2012, "I would absolutely love to build this game. It would take place on Oddworld and would be able to play with the inherent dynamics we've built into the world. Tone, humour, depth, but it would be much, much darker and more brutal, though not gratuitous." The initial development of Fangus Klot came at a time of great change and arguably instability for Oddworld Inhabitants. Having had a bad experience with EA as their publishers, who Lorne blamed for relatively bad sales of Stranger's Wrath despite high acclaim and people loving that game due to a lack of marketing from EA because they didn't own Oddworld and so had no interest in pushing the game. An idea that is backed up by the fact the game sold more when it was re-released years later than it did in 2005. As a result, Lorne Lanning realised that the position Oddworld Inhabitants was in with its publishers was more of a master-slave relationship and wanted to avoid this. Initially they tested the waters by looking into other publishers and made a deal with MAJESCO Entertainment to publish Fangus. However, while the game was in development, MAJESCO said, "I'm altering the deal, pray I don't alter it any further," and attempted to renegotiate the contract they had, which was rejected by Oddworld Inhabitants and proved Lorne's theory that the developer-published relationship is not one an independent studio and intellectual property could survive in without eventually being the victim of a hostile takeover. They kept being mucked about by publishers that just played games with them. Lorne said, "We had every intention of building the game, and then the shenanigans started, so we just said, we're not going to play this game." As if that wasn't enough, the team building the game were working with an engine that only supported the original Xbox that Fangus was intended to be released on, at a time when Microsoft was focusing and only technologically supporting companies working on the upcoming Xbox 360. As a result of this, Lorne Lanning and Sherry McKenna decided to put all their games on hold, including Fangus Klot, and closed down Oddworld Inhabitants game development studios. A surprising amount of work was done on the brutal ballad of Fangus Klot, to the point that when Just Add Water took over the development of the Oddworld games in 2010, they said that they played a very early build of the game on the Xbox prototype engine, and that a ton of concept art has been done for it. It is a game that has endured in the heads of Oddworld fans as being of great interest and fascination, and although Lorne said financing it is the obstacle to getting it made, Just Add Water were interested in reviving the project, potentially after they made Hand of Odd, and in 2011 an Oddworld Inhabitants representative confirmed Fangus Klot was in future plans. But of course, none of this unfortunately came to pass, and the company is now on a very different trajectory than it was a decade ago. As Oddworld Inhabitants is focusing on finishing the Oddworld quintology currently, which will presumably take a number of years, it's probably highly likely that it would take a very long time for Fangus Klot to be resurrected, if this ever ends up ever happening at all. But considering Lorne Lanning says it's still a story that he'd love to tell, I certainly hope that one day this video will become out of date in terms of Fangus being an unreleased game, and that we will finally get to play and experience the brutal ballad of Fangus Klot.
Hello, follow me.